You may be reading the title right now and asking yourself, oh no, am I in the wrong class? It says this is for asset managers. Who are asset managers? If you are involved with the process of maintaining, repairing, or upgrading assets on an Air Force base, then you are an asset manager. In today's civil engineer enterprise, asset management is not one person's or one flight's problem. It is a fundamental underpinning to what we do. Now that you know you are in the right place, let's talk about why this lesson matters to you. Asset management is all about getting the most out of every dollar we spend, investing the right dollar in the right asset at the right time. But how do we invest in assets? Where does the money come from? What are the limitations of our financial resources? As engineers, we identify requirements and pay for those requirements using government funds collected from taxpayers. For this reason, there are rules associated on how we can spend those funds. In addition, there are several different units or offices who manage these funds. Therefore, it is important to understand the money if you want to succeed at getting your requirements funded. Truth be told, the majority of the dollars we use to invest in our assets come from a congressional appropriation called Operations and Maintenance, or O&M. It's fundamental to asset managers to know the basic rules regarding investing in assets using O&M dollars. Nearly all spending in base-level civil engineer squadrons is within this appropriation. This appropriation also funds the projects executed from AFCAC's Construction Tasking Order, or CTO. The objective of this lesson is for you to know the basic financial management principles that affect funding asset managers' requirements in 4 different categories. First, you need to have a general understanding of appropriations. We will focus on the Operations and Maintenance, or O&M appropriation, which is often referred to as 3400. Because each appropriation is structured a bit differently and has different rules about spending them, we will discuss the O&M appropriation in a bit of detail. Next, we will discuss common accounting terms. While it's not important for you to know a resource advisor's job, it is important for you to recognize certain accounting terms and the purpose of a few key accounting elements. Then we will cover work requirements and knowing applicable fund sources. We will briefly explain classifying work and the funds associated with specific work classifications. This is always really important to know because the way work is classified determines the funds we use, and some of those funds are easier to get than others. Lastly, you will learn the difference between centrally and decentrally managed funds. This is important to understand because one provides much more flexibility and is much easier to obtain. Now let's get started. So when we have a requirement to invest in an asset, what money can we spend? Let's start by talking about appropriated funds. Appropriated funds can be defined as funds set aside by Congress that permits us, the Air Force, to obligate the federal government to pay for goods and services. And for the most part, they are derived from taxpayer dollars. Appropriated funds are for a specific purpose, usually during a specified time period. I say usually, quote unquote, because there are some appropriations which are not bound to a specific period, called no-year funds. There are a couple of appropriations on your screen: Operations and Maintenance, O&M, and Military Construction, MILCON. Notice there is also a 4-digit code associated with them. We use this code in exchange for stating and or typing the title on all of our funding documents. In other words, if we say $3,400, we mean money from the Operations and Maintenance appropriation. You'll see that beneath each of these codes is a time frame. This means that we have 1 year to expend $3,400 and 5 years to spend $3,300. Whenever we refer to the military finance, the years we refer to are not calendar years, but fiscal years. Fiscal years run from 1 October to 30 September. For our purposes. As an example, the fiscal year 2018 began on 1 October 2017. It is important to note an appropriation does not represent money set aside in the Treasury. It represents amounts agencies, such as the Air Force, may obligate during the period of time specified in the respective Appropriations Act. Now that we know what an appropriation is, let's discuss what we can spend these appropriated dollars on. The U.S. Constitution states, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law." This means that we cannot withdraw money from the bank unless written by law. The laws that fulfill this requirement are 1. The NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, and 2. The Appropriations Act. One gives us authority to spend appropriated funds, while the other provides the funds. However, we must have both laws to legally spend appropriated funds. Next, we will explain the NDAA and appropriations law in a bit more detail. The NDAA is an act of Congress that permits specific federal programs or activities to exist. It authorizes defense-related programs to include such items as procurement quantities, military end strength, construction projects, and the recommended funding levels to accomplish those programs. Think of the NDAA as a checkbook. You can go to the bank and open a new checking account. You sign some papers, show an ID card, and provide your legal signature on a signature card to establish the checking account. At this point, you are authorized to sign checks. However, do you have any money in this account yet? No. Therefore, you have the authority to spend money, but you do not have any money to spend. Each year, a new NDAA is signed. Sometimes the rules of our checkbook change. Using CE as an example, the FY15 or fiscal year 2015 National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, changed the authorization on how much we are allowed to spend for minor construction using O&M dollars. The threshold was raised from $750,000 to $1 million. Let's talk about that for a minute. In the past, we have been allowed to spend up to $750,000 of O&M funds to fund minor construction. If the minor construction work would exceed $750,000, then it had to be funded from military construction appropriation, which is much more difficult to obtain and is very political. But since the FY15 NDAA, that threshold has been raised to $1 million. Therefore, we are allowed to spend up to $1 million on minor construction projects using O&M dollars. Though the Act is intended to be signed annually prior to the start of a fiscal year in October, in recent years, the NDAA has typically been signed in the December timeframe. But we need more than just the NDAA, which just gives us the authority to spend money. We also need the Appropriations Act because that gives us the money or our actual budget. The Appropriations Act is a statutory authorization to incur obligations and make payments out of the Treasury for specified purposes. As we mentioned before, agencies need an appropriation in order to spend funds. It allows us to buy goods and services. Going back to our checkbook example, the Appropriations Act is what puts money in our bank account. In other words, it provides us the budget we have to spend. To summarize the difference between these two laws, we would say we need authority to spend money, which we get from the National Defense Authorization Act, and we also need money to spend, which we receive from the Appropriations Act. When we have both, we can spend appropriated funds. You may be asking yourself, what happens when we do not pass the NDAA and the Appropriations Act? And that is a good question. One of two things will happen. The government shuts down, or 2, the President signs a Continuing Resolution Authority, or CRA. Remember, we need the authority to spend money, if not by the NDAA and Appropriations Act, then from a CRA. A continuing resolution continues the pre-existing appropriations at the same levels as the previous fiscal year, or with minor modifications, for a set amount of time. As a result, we are very cautious when spending. A CRA, or Continuing Resolution Authority, is basically a temporary appropriations act. It provides budget authority when no appropriation has been signed and says that you may continue operations as you did the previous year. Typically, we are authorized to spend 80% or some other specified rate of the previous year's execution amount. So what does that mean? Agencies will look at last year's budget to see how much we spent and make sure they do not spend more than 80% of that while under a CRA. You may be asking yourself, why do we even have a limit? The CRA has given us authority to spend, and we are spending, so why are we limited? It is because we do not have a budget and do not know how much money we will have available once the Appropriations Act is signed. And just because we submitted our budget request for a certain amount, we won't necessarily receive that amount. So until we truly have a budget, we want to ensure we do not bounce checks, quote unquote, before we are given our official budget. That is the reason for the 80% restriction. Some points to remember are that 1. A CRA is a temporary appropriations bill or act. 2. It must be signed by the President to be enacted at the President, and the President can veto it like any other bill. 3. Other restrictions in the previous year's appropriations bill must be adhered to. 4. CRA will expire once an appropriation bill is signed. 5. There can be no new starts when a CRA is in effect. We should briefly discuss the concept of new starts because oftentimes in CE we confuse that with new work. A new start is a program that did not exist in the previous year. An example may be researching a new sensor on a weapon system. It does not mean installing a door in a facility. That may be new work, but it is not a new start. As we mentioned earlier, an appropriation is money for a specific purpose, usually during a specified time period. Some other terms you may hear an appropriation referred to as is bag of money, pot of money, or color of money. Looking at the 3400 bag on your slide, you can see it is for operations and maintenance and is available for 1 year. And you can see there are other O&M funds other than just 3400. These other O&M funds are set aside to provide resources for a particular unique function in the Air Force. When we invest in assets in our bases, it is extremely important to understand that if those assets fall under Defense Health, Family Housing, Air National Guard, or Air Force Reserve, we must invest using those specific appropriations. Simply put, anytime we do work for an organization on our installation that receives its own O&M funding, we must get reimbursed for that work. If we do not collect the reimbursement, we are violating fiscal law. Let's say, for example, you go over and do some work in housing. You may think, well, they're part of CE, so we will not charge them for this work. As you can see here, Family Housing has its own O&M funds in appropriation 0745. If we use $3,400 to fund family housing requirements, we are spending money that was not only appropriated for other uses, we are spending money that we did not budget for. This is commonly referred to as augmenting an appropriation, which is illegal. This illustrates why it is important you understand how the funding works and that there are several other O&M appropriations. CE isn't funded to take care of everything. While it is important for you to realize that there are other O&M appropriations, the one most common to you is 3400. Let's expand upon this appropriation in greater detail, as the majority of our asset investments are funded in this pot of money. One of the purposes for these funds is to operate and maintain the base. Therefore, a majority of funds obligated in CE are O&M dollars. However, they are not specific to CE. Other units on base use them as well. The O&M appropriation is structured by Budget Activity Code, which is how Congress appropriates its funds and how bases receive them. Depending on other missions on an installation, a base may receive funds more than in one BA. However, only very limited reprogramming is permitted within these budget activity codes and is not allowed at base level. In other words, bases cannot mix BA01 and BA02 funds together. It is a one-year appropriation, which means we can use these funds to make legal purchases throughout the fiscal year. We can use O&M dollars on minor construction work up to $1 million. If it is over $1 million, then we must use MILCON dollars. MILCON is an entirely different appropriation and much more difficult to obtain. Typically, we must use the other procurement appropriation, that is 3080 to purchase equipment items costing $250,000 or more, but we may use O&M dollars if the equipment item is less than $250,000. There are some other rules and exceptions to this, but for this audience, just know if you have equipment greater than $250,000, it is typically funded with 3080 funds. We must obligate 80% of these funds no later than 31 July. This means that by 1 August, we should only have 20% of our budget remaining. This is written into law, and if not adhered to, we run the risk of losing funding. At this point, you should be a bit more familiar about appropriated funds, so now it is time to learn some FM or financial management lingo. Knowing these terms and concepts may help you communicate with your CE resource advisor, and you may have more success when requesting funds. Remember, it is crucial to understand the rules and terminology we use to manage the resources which support asset management decisions. This is a very common term you may have already heard your resource advisor speak of numerous times. When we say funds have been committed, what we are actually saying is that we plan or intend to use a certain amount of our unit's budget to fund a requirement. A common example is when we submit a Form 9 to contracting. Let's say we submit a Form 9 to replace an air compressor that will cost $4,000. Our resource advisor will first review that Form 9 to ensure our unit has $4,000 available and ensure it is a legal purchase. If it's good to go, then the RA forwards it to the Comptroller Squadron, who will conduct the same review that your resource advisor accomplished. Once the Comptroller Squadron reviews and confirms funds are available, they move these funds into an accounting system and park them in an accounting place we refer to as commitments. So you may hear your funds have been committed, or that $4,000 has been moved to commitments, or that you have $4,000 sitting in commitments. The example on the slide illustrates how this works in the accounting system. If a higher priority requirement needs these funds, they could easily be pulled back out of commitments. The area of caution is if you have funds sitting in commitments for a long period of time, you run the risk of losing them. If your unit or Comptroller Squadron is looking for funds and they see a $4,000 requirement has been sitting in commitments for 90 days, they may determine your requirement isn't necessary right now and pull those funds from you. So it is very important you continue to follow up on your requirements to ensure they are funded promptly. To further illustrate this concept, let's look at the example on your screen. It shows you had a balance of $20,000 on the 16th of July, then a Form 9 was submitted to purchase some audiovisual equipment costing $5,000. The Comptroller Squadron will move these funds into the commitment stage in the accounting system. Now our available balance is $15,000, but we haven't spent the $5,000 yet, correct? If the electric shop had just had a $20,000 transformer blow on the 17th of July, do we have enough money to fund that requirement? Well, that's a leadership decision because we do not have $20,000 available. However, leadership can decide to put the Form 9 on hold and move the $5,000 back into the available balance so we can purchase a new transformer. Otherwise, the electric shop will have to seek funds elsewhere. But if we didn't commit those funds or quote-unquote administratively reserve them, we would not have had any money left to purchase the audio-visual equipment. Decommitting funds is an easy accounting transaction, and you will not be penalized for doing so. But what if we had already spent the $5,000? Let's talk about that next. Obligation is the next stage funds will move to from the commitment stage. Using the same Form 9 example when we discuss commitments, once contracting awards the contract, those funds are obligated. At this point, it is not easy for them to get them back like it was when we committed them. While committing funds is an administrative reservation of funds, obligating funds is a legal reservation. If we would change our minds and try to get those funds back, we could incur fines and penalties. Therefore, once funds are obligated, you no longer run the risk of them being taken from you. Once your requirement has been obligated, you will want to ensure that you continue to follow up until you receive them. Now you may say it is not your responsibility to monitor your requirements. That is an RA's job. And you would be partly correct. The resource advisor is responsible for ensuring that we receive what we pay for. But you are close to this requirement, whereas the RA has to monitor requirements for the entire squadron. Therefore, it does help if you stay on top of your requirements that when they are received. A program element represents a particular military capability or support activity with associated costs required to accomplish the Air Force mission. The one that should be most familiar to you at base level is Program Element Code 78, which is Air Force Sustainment. If you are at AFCAC, or the Air Force Civil Engineer Center, you may be a bit more familiar with PEC 76, Air Force Restoration Modernization. There are several other program elements for other DoD services. If you are at Joint Base, it is likely that you will use Army or Navy program elements. Instead of an F at the end of the PEC, which is the program element code, such as 78, and then you'll see an F, it'll end in A or Alpha or November. A for Army, N for Navy. When we develop our budgets, we build them starting at the PEC level. For example, the shops may identify their travel and work order material requirements individually, but those requirements get rolled up into the applicable PEC when asking for funding. As an asset manager, you must work with your financial manager to ensure the applicable fund source is matched with your requirements. That way, the financial manager can request funding for your identified requirements. Another common accounting term you should be familiar with is an element of expense/investment code, referred to as an EEIC and pronounced EEC. This code basically explains what was purchased or what service was received. For example, 409 defines travel costs such as travel for professional military education, deployments, training, etc. While asset managers are not responsible for using the applicable EECs, many conversations about funding revolve around EECs such as 521 and 524 or 522 and 529. This awareness will be beneficial when having conversations with financial managers and project programmers. Notice on your screen there is a column titled Object Class. The financial world is going through an accounting system transformation, so depending on whether you have the legacy system, which is referred to as BQ, or the new system, which is referred to as DEEMS, will determine whether you track the expense element using an EEC or object class. Because everyone is so used to using EECs and CE, and because not every base has transformed in DEEMS, I suspect it will be quite a while before we stop using the term EEC. Before we move on to requirements, I want to show you this basic O&M hierarchy. Oftentimes, after discussing the various elements within the O&M 3400 appropriation, people confuse a PAC with an appropriation, so I like to show this illustration. Here you can see how we break down the 3400 appropriation to show where the money is being spent. The big takeaway here is PEC 78 sustainment is O&M dollars. It is just further describing what we spent O&M dollars on. So if we end up using sustainment dollars on a requirement that should have been funded with restoration and modernization dollars, there is no fiscal law violation. That is considered ignoring a policy if we do that, but not violating the law. Let's walk through this hierarchy starting at the top with O&M appropriation 3400. We learned that 3400 appropriation is further broken down by budget activity or BA. Then the PEC explains the program. Do you remember this in the building block to building our budget? We budget at the PEC level, and then we break it down even further by showing who spent the money and what they spent it on. That is done using an RCCC, or Responsibility Cost Center, and that just basically means the shops. It's a code that identifies what shop it is. And then the EEC. Just remember, EECs are referred to as object classes once your base goes to DEEMS, that new accounting system. However, I suspect CE will remain using the term EEC for quite some time. Bottom line, when we say we spent 78 sustainment dollars or 521 EEC dollars, we are still spending O&M appropriated dollars. Now that you know a little more about appropriated funds and common elements, I want to talk to you about funding requirements. Many times we say there's no sense identifying a certain requirement because no funding is available for it. We'll never obtain the funding, or we don't have any money in our budget. Well, just remember, we do not fund requirements that do not exist. So if you do not identify the requirement, you are correct. There is no funding for it. So rather than worry about funding first, we need to identify the requirement first. Then, once we do that, then we can solicit for applicable funding. With that said, let's talk briefly about requirements. When we are referring to facility requirements, we are typically referring to some sort of work that needs to be done. Some of those requirements are listed on this slide. Preventive maintenance is recurring work such as changing filters and belts. Corrective maintenance refers to something breaking and needing to be repaired. An example of life cycle replacement could be replacing a 20-year-old roof. Without a doubt, it has lasted its normal life cycle. Renovation and modernization deals with restoring a facility to its original condition, perhaps after a storm or fire. Modernization work would be to implement a higher standard, and construction means to build, develop, or extend real property. All of these work requirements fall under three possible classifications: maintenance, repair, construction. Once it has been classified, then we can determine the funds. We just mentioned work classifications. There are only three written into law: maintenance, repair, and construction. You will notice enhancement work and nice-to-haves work requirements are not listed, although we do a lot of that type of work as well. The work classification will dictate the applicable funding source. Unlike work classifications, which are directed by law, fund source are dictated by policy. When we associate funds to work classification, we are referring to our facility program element codes: 7.8 for sustainment, 7.6 restoration modernization. Notice on the slide, repair could be funded with sustainment, or it could be funded with restoration modernization. It depends on whether the repair is life cycle repair or not. For example, if we replace a 25-year-old roof, it is fair to say that roof was on the end of its life cycle. Therefore, it is funded with its sustainment dollars. On the other hand, if that roof was only 5 years old and had to be replaced, that is not its normal life cycle and would be funded with R&M dollars. I think the next slide illustrates this best when we will discuss these two PECs, or program element codes, in greater detail. This chart highlights the work classification and its associated fund source. Notice maintenance will always be sustainment, in other words, PEC 7.8, while repair may be either PEC 7.8 or PEC 7.6. Now let's take a look at these PECs we've been talking about in a bit more detail. Here's another good quick glance sheet to match the applicable funding with work classification. Notice the EECs are applicable to the Air Force accounting system being phased out, in other words, BQ. If your base has transitioned to DEEMS, this will be an object class, and your FMer can assist you with the crosswalk from EEC to object class. However, the programming AFIs still refer to EECs, and because we have used this term for so long, I think we will use the term EEC for quite some time. Here are a few examples of work requirements considered maintenance and repair. You can see how all of these support keeping facilities in good working order. In the maintenance examples, we've got painting, some elevator inspections, hood and duct cleaning, and then for repair, it could be a regular roof replacement that's gone through its normal life cycle. So remember, if it's 25 years, then that's acceptable to think that that's how long a roof should last. Refinishing wall services, maybe repairing and replacing some HVAC systems. All of these are different examples. The list goes on and on, but this should give you a really good idea of what's the difference between a maintenance and repair. Here are some examples of restoration and modernization repair. Remember, the key word between sustainment and restoration and modernization is life cycle. Maintenance is automatically sustainment, but repair depends on the life cycle. Normal life cycle, sustainment. Non-life cycle, restoration and modernization. Lastly, here are a few examples of construction requirements where we use restoration and modernization funds. It is important to note that we can only use O&M funds up to $1 million for construction. In other words, we can use restoration and modernization up to $1 million. Anything over that threshold has to be funded by the MILCON appropriation. So far, we have just talked about facility requirements, but there are many other CE requirements, aren't there? And we have certain funding sources for those as well. In this next section, we will talk about those other requirements and funding sources just so you are familiar with them. Think of this program as a municipality. It funds requirements such as custodial, grounds maintenance, refuse collection, and pest management, just to name a few. There is not really a lot of wiggle room when it comes to these funds. As you can see on the slide, this program funds many of our must-pays. Those are bills such as utilities and refuse contracts. We have to ensure those get paid. Refer to Air Force Instruction 3210140, which provides good guidance and spells out inclusions and exclusions. But be aware this AFI, or Air Force Instruction, is very outdated and going through massive revisions. This program funds the initial issue of furnishings, that is, furniture, appliances, and equipment, for newly constructed and renovated facilities, as well as the management of replacement furnishings, that is, repair, replace, control, moving, and handling, inventory, warehousing, and disposal. There are 3 program elements that fund environmental requirements, all of which fall under the Environmental Quality Program. They're pretty self-explanatory just by reading the title. Conservation resources help protect the birds and turtles. Pollution prevention helps prevent pollution. And the big one that gets people nervous is environmental compliance. Typically, we equate compliance with Environmental Protection Agency. At this point, you should understand what an appropriation is, as well as the various PECs that may fund your requirements. But what we didn't discuss is where these funds are managed. We have decentralized funds, which include 7.8 sustainment, 7.9 facilities operations, and 5.53 unaccompanied housing. Air Force IMSC manages these and are the ones who distribute them directly to the base in accordance with its execution plan. These are considered discretionary funds, which allows our base level engineers some spending flexibility. Centralized funds, which include 7.6 restoration modernization and some 7.8 sustainment, and the 3 environmental PECs we mentioned earlier, are non-discretionary. AFCAC manages these dollars and distributes to the bases by project. In other words, bases receive these funds for specified projects with specified amounts. Base level engineers cannot spend them elsewhere. The next few slides are for visualization purposes to illustrate what PECs are managed at each center. This slide shows Air Force IMSC managed funds, which we stated are discretionary. AFCAC manages these funds and are considered non-discretionary. This chart is meant to be a single image illustrating funds that go to the base for execution versus the ones AFCAC manages. Notice there are also PECs categorized as protection programs. I left them on the chart for your situational awareness. However, we did not discuss these since you most likely will not be involved with these funds. And that brings us to the finish line. We made it. We talked about a lot in this short lesson. We covered appropriated funds and how to account for them, as well as a few accounting terms. Do you still remember what a commitment and obligation are? Commitments are administrative reservation of funds, while an obligation is a legal reservation of funds. Then we discussed the importance of identifying requirements first before the applicable fund source, and lastly, we differentiated between decentralized and centralized funding. Air Force IMSC manages the decentralized funds, which are sustainment, facility operations, and unaccompanied housing programs. We refer to these funds as discretionary because the base level engineer may spend them as he deems necessary. AFCAC manages centralized funds, which are restoration modernization, some sustainment, and environmental quality programs. We refer to these funds as non-discretionary and are dispersed by project. As an asset manager, it is necessary for you to understand the different types of funds you must request for your requirements. Any knowledge you gain in this area will help ensure your mission requirements are accomplished.